This channel examines the Jeffrey Epstein case using court documents, public records, and verified reporting. We do not speculate. We do not accuse. We document what exists, and what remains unanswered. Everything presented here is drawn from publicly available sources. This is not a theory channel. This is the file. In any major investigation, there is often a gap between what is known and what is brought to trial. This gap is not accidental. It is a result of how the legal system defines the scope of a case. A criminal trial does not attempt to examine every possible event, connection, or allegation. Instead, it focuses on specific charges, supported by evidence that meets strict legal standards. These charges are selected based on what can be clearly defined, proven, and presented within the rules of the court. This creates an important distinction. There is a difference between investigative material and trial evidence. Investigative material may include a wide range of information, documents, witness statements, leads, and connections that help build an overall understanding of a situation. However, not all of this material becomes part of a trial. To be included in court, evidence must meet criteria such as relevance, reliability, and admissibility. If it does not meet these standards, it cannot be used, regardless of whether it exists within investigative records. This is one of the primary reasons why some information is never brought to trial. Another factor is case structure. Prosecutors must define a case in a way that is clear and manageable. This often means focusing on a specific timeframe, location, or set of actions. Expanding beyond that scope can make a case more difficult to prove and present effectively. As a result, even within a larger investigation, only certain elements are selected for prosecution. This does not mean that other elements are unimportant. It means they are outside the defined scope of the case. There are also practical limitations. Courts operate within time constraints, procedural rules, and evidentiary boundaries. A trial cannot include every possible detail without becoming unmanageable. Decisions must be made about what is essential to proving the charges. This process is guided by strategy as well as law. Prosecutors aim to present the strongest possible case, which often involves focusing on the most clearly supported evidence, rather than attempting to address every aspect of a broader investigation. Understanding these limits is critical. Because when a trial concludes, it represents a defined legal outcome, not a complete account of everything that may have been investigated or discussed. In complex cases, this distinction becomes especially important. It explains why certain documents, testimonies, or connections may exist in records, but are not part of the courtroom proceedings. Once an investigation gathers a wide range of material, the next step is not to present all of it in court, but to select which evidence will be used. This selection process is one of the most important factors in determining what ultimately appears at trial. Evidence is not chosen at random. Prosecutors evaluate material based on legal standards and strategic considerations. The goal is to build a case that is clear, focused, and capable of meeting the required burden of proof. The first criterion is relevance. Evidence must directly relate to the charges being presented. Even if a document or statement is part of a broader investigation, it will not be included unless it helps establish one or more elements of a specific charge. This immediately narrows the field. A large volume of investigative material may exist, but only a portion of it will be directly connected to the legal claims being tested in court. The second criterion is admissibility. Courts operate under strict rules that determine what can and cannot be presented. Evidence must be obtained legally, properly documented, and free from issues that could make it unreliable or unfairly prejudicial. If evidence does not meet these standards, it is excluded, even if it appears significant in an investigative context. This is a key reason why some material is never seen by a jury. Another factor is clarity. Prosecutors aim to present evidence that can be easily understood and clearly connected to the charges. Complex or ambiguous material may be less effective in court, even if it provides additional context. This leads to selective emphasis. Rather than presenting every possible detail, the case is built around the most consistent and verifiable elements. This helps ensure that the argument remains focused and persuasive. There is also the issue of redundancy. If multiple pieces of evidence support the same point, prosecutors may choose only the strongest examples. Including too much repetitive material can complicate the presentation without adding significant value. Another important consideration is risk. Certain evidence, while relevant, may introduce complications, such as opening the door to counter-arguments or creating confusion. In these cases, prosecutors may decide that the potential drawbacks outweigh the benefits. This highlights the strategic nature of evidence selection. It is not only about what exists, but about what can be effectively presented and defended in court. The result is a curated set of material. What appears at trial is a filtered version of the investigation, shaped by legal rules and strategic decisions. This explains why some information, despite being documented or discussed, never reaches the courtroom. It is not necessarily dismissed, but rather excluded from the specific legal framework of the case. Understanding this process helps clarify an important point. A trial does not represent everything that is known. It represents what has been selected, structured, and presented to meet legal standards. Even when evidence is relevant and potentially important, it cannot be presented in court unless it meets strict rules of admissibility. These rules are a central reason why some material, despite being part of an investigation, is never brought to trial. Admissibility is about legal reliability and fairness. Courts require that evidence meet established standards before it can be shown to a jury. This ensures that decisions are based on material that is both trustworthy and appropriate within the legal process. One of the most important requirements is how evidence is obtained. If material is collected in a way that violates legal procedures, it may be excluded from trial. This applies even if the content itself appears relevant or significant. The method of collection must follow legal rules. Another key factor is verification. Evidence must be shown to be authentic. Documents, communications, and records need to be confirmed as genuine, with clear origins and no signs of alteration. Without this verification, the evidence cannot be relied upon in court. There is also the issue of hearsay. Hearsay refers to statements made outside of court that are presented to prove the truth of what was said. In many cases, hearsay is not admissible unless it falls within specific legal exceptions. This limits the use of certain types of statements, even if they appear relevant. This rule highlights an important principle. Courts prioritize evidence that can be directly examined and challenged, rather than second-hand accounts that cannot be fully tested. Another consideration is prejudice versus probative value. Even if evidence is relevant, it may be excluded if it is likely to unfairly influence the jury or create confusion. Courts must balance the value of the evidence against the risk that it could distort the decision-making process. This can lead to the exclusion of material that is dramatic or attention-grabbing, but not essential to proving the charges. There is also the issue of completeness. Partial or fragmented evidence may be difficult to interpret accurately. If key context is missing, the material may not meet the standard required for admissibility. This is particularly relevant in cases involving large volumes of records, where only portions of communication or documentation are available. Another limitation involves relevance to the specific charges. Even if evidence is admissible in a general sense, it must still be directly connected to the case being tried. Material that relates to other events or individuals may be excluded if it does not contribute to proving the defined charges. These rules collectively shape what the jury sees. They act as a filter, ensuring that only evidence meeting legal standards is presented during the trial. The result is a carefully controlled set of information. What remains outside the courtroom is not necessarily dismissed, but it is not part of the legally tested record. Understanding admissibility helps explain why some information, even if widely discussed, never becomes part of the trial itself. It is not enough for evidence to exist. It must also meet the standards required to be heard and evaluated in court. Beyond evidence selection and admissibility, another major factor determines what is never brought to trial: time. Legal systems operate within defined timeframes, and these limits can directly affect whether certain allegations are eligible to be prosecuted. One of the most important concepts is the statute of limitations. This refers to the maximum period after an event during which legal proceedings can be initiated. Once that period expires, charges related to that event may no longer be brought in court, regardless of the available evidence. This creates a significant boundary. Even if investigators uncover information about past events, those events may fall outside the legally permitted timeframe for prosecution. In such cases, the issue is not whether something can be proven, it is whether it can be pursued under the law. Statutes of limitations vary. They depend on the type of offense, the jurisdiction, and the laws in place at the time. Some offenses have longer limitation periods, while others may have none at all. Changes in law can also affect how these timeframes are applied. Another important factor is jurisdiction. Events that occur across different locations may be subject to different legal systems, each with its own rules and deadlines. This can complicate decisions about where and how charges can be filed. In complex cases, this creates fragmentation. Certain events may be legally actionable in one jurisdiction but not in another. As a result, only specific portions of a broader situation may be eligible for prosecution. Timing also affects availability of evidence. As time passes, records may be lost, memories may fade, and witnesses may become unavailable. These factors can make it more difficult to meet the standard of proof required in court. Even if a case is technically within the statute of limitations, these challenges can influence whether it is practical to pursue. There is also the issue of when information becomes known. In some cases, key evidence or testimony emerges years after the events in question. By that time, legal deadlines may already have passed, limiting what can be brought to trial. This creates a gap between discovery and prosecution. Information may exist and be documented, but not all of it can be translated into legal action due to time constraints. Another consideration is case focus. Even when multiple events fall within allowable timeframes, prosecutors may choose to concentrate on those that are most clearly supported by evidence. This can leave other events outside the scope of the trial. The result is a legally defined subset of a larger timeline. What is brought to trial represents what is both legally viable and strategically selected within those time limits. Understanding these constraints is essential. It explains why certain allegations, even when documented or discussed, are never presented in court. They are not necessarily dismissed, but they are restricted by the legal boundaries of time. In addition to time limits and evidentiary rules, another major factor determines what is never brought to trial: jurisdiction. In complex cases involving multiple locations, jurisdiction defines which court has the authority to hear specific charges. Jurisdiction is not universal. A single court cannot automatically address events that occurred in different countries, states, or legal systems. Each location operates under its own laws, procedures, and prosecutorial authority. This creates fragmentation. Events that are connected in an investigative sense may fall under entirely separate legal frameworks. As a result, what appears to be one continuous set of actions may be divided into multiple legal cases, or not pursued at all in certain areas. One key issue is where an event is considered to have occurred. For example, communication might originate in one location, involve individuals in another, and relate to events in a third. Determining which jurisdiction applies can be complex and may limit where charges can be filed. Another factor is cooperation between jurisdictions. Different legal systems must coordinate to share evidence, transfer information, or pursue related cases. This process can be slow and may not always result in unified action. If coordination is limited, some aspects of a case may remain outside the reach of a particular trial. There are also differences in legal definitions and standards. What qualifies as a chargeable offense in one jurisdiction may not be defined in the same way elsewhere. This affects whether certain actions can be prosecuted at all, depending on where they occurred. This leads to selective inclusion. Prosecutors often focus on events that clearly fall within their jurisdiction and meet their legal standards. Other events, while potentially connected, may be excluded because they belong to a different legal authority. Another complication is evidence access. Records, witnesses, or documentation located in another jurisdiction may be difficult to obtain or use in court. Legal barriers, privacy laws, or procedural differences can restrict how evidence is shared. This can prevent certain material from being included in a trial, even if it exists. As a result, the trial reflects only a portion of the overall picture. It includes events that are legally actionable within a specific jurisdiction, supported by accessible evidence, and aligned with prosecutorial authority. Everything outside that scope remains untested in that particular court. This does not mean those elements are irrelevant. It means they are outside the legal reach of the specific case being tried. Understanding jurisdiction helps explain why some aspects of complex investigations never appear in a single trial, even when they are part of a broader narrative. It highlights the limits of legal authority in cases that span multiple locations, systems, and legal frameworks. During any large-scale investigation, not all information begins as verified evidence. Much of it starts as leads, pieces of information that suggest a possible connection, event, or line of inquiry. These leads play an important role in guiding investigators, but they do not automatically become part of a trial. A lead is not the same as evidence. It may come from a tip, a partial document, a witness statement, or a pattern identified during analysis. Its purpose is to direct further investigation, not to establish a legal claim on its own. For a lead to become evidence, it must be verified and supported. This often requires additional documentation, corroborating testimony, or confirmation through independent sources. If that process cannot be completed, the information remains unconfirmed. This is one of the main reasons why some material is never brought to trial. Even if a lead appears significant, it cannot be used in court unless it meets the standards of reliability and admissibility. Without verification, it cannot support a legal argument. Another factor is consistency. Investigators look for alignment between different sources. If a lead cannot be matched with other evidence, such as records, timelines, or additional testimony, it may remain unresolved. Unresolved leads do not disappear. They are often documented and retained as part of the investigative record. However, they exist in a different category, one that is informational rather than evidentiary. There is also the issue of resource allocation. Investigations must prioritize certain lines of inquiry over others. Leads that are more likely to result in verifiable evidence receive greater attention, while others may not be pursued as extensively. This creates a natural filtering process. Some leads are developed into formal findings. Others remain incomplete due to limited information, time constraints, or lack of supporting material. Another challenge is conflicting information. Different sources may provide accounts that do not fully align. In such cases, investigators must determine whether discrepancies can be resolved. If they cannot, the information may not reach the level required for courtroom use. This reinforces an important principle. Courts rely on confirmed and testable evidence, not on possibilities or unverified claims. Even credible leads must be transformed into provable facts before they can be presented. As a result, a significant portion of investigative work remains outside the trial process. These leads contribute to understanding the broader context, but they do not become part of the legally established record. Understanding this distinction helps clarify why some information, despite being documented or discussed, never appears in court. It is not ignored. It is simply not elevated to the level required for legal proof. Not every legal issue uncovered in an investigation is fully examined in a courtroom. One of the key reasons is the role of plea agreements and legal strategy, which can significantly shape what is ultimately brought to trial, and what is not. A plea agreement is a negotiated resolution. Instead of proceeding through a full trial on every possible charge, the prosecution and defense may agree to resolve certain matters in exchange for a guilty plea to specific counts. This allows the case to move forward without litigating every detail in court. This has a direct impact on scope. When a plea agreement is reached, the focus narrows to selected charges, while other potential allegations or lines of inquiry may not be pursued within that proceeding. This does not necessarily reflect the importance of those omitted elements. Rather, it reflects a strategic decision about how to resolve the case within the legal system. Legal strategy also plays a broader role. Prosecutors must decide how to present a case that is clear, efficient, and capable of meeting the burden of proof. This often involves focusing on the strongest, most provable charges, rather than attempting to address every possible issue. This approach reduces complexity. A case that includes too many charges or overly broad allegations can become difficult to present and harder for a jury to evaluate. By narrowing the focus, prosecutors aim to build a coherent and persuasive argument. From the defense perspective, strategy is equally important. Attorneys may seek to limit the scope of the case, challenge the inclusion of certain evidence, or negotiate outcomes that avoid extended litigation. These efforts can influence which aspects of a case are ultimately addressed in court. Another important factor is judicial efficiency. Courts must manage time, resources, and procedural requirements. Resolving some issues through agreements or focused charges helps ensure that trials remain manageable and within practical limits. This contributes to selective examination. Even when multiple lines of investigation exist, only a portion may be fully explored during trial proceedings. There is also the matter of risk management. Both sides consider the uncertainty of trial outcomes. Prosecutors may prioritize charges with the strongest evidentiary support, while the defense may seek to avoid the risk of more severe penalties. These considerations shape decisions about what is pursued and what is left outside the courtroom. The result is a legally defined narrative. What is brought to trial represents a strategic selection of issues, rather than a complete exploration of all investigative material. Understanding this helps explain why some aspects of a case are never fully examined in court. They are not necessarily dismissed or disproven, they are simply not included within the chosen legal pathway. Another major reason why certain information is never brought to trial, or never fully revealed, is the existence of sealed records and confidentiality restrictions. These legal mechanisms control what information can be made public and what remains restricted, even within an ongoing case. Sealed records are official documents that are not accessible to the public. Courts may decide to seal certain materials for a variety of reasons. This does not mean the information is irrelevant, it means that access to it is limited under legal authority. One common reason is protection of individuals. Cases involving sensitive subject matter may include personal information, identities, or details that courts determine should not be publicly disclosed. Sealing records helps prevent harm, protect privacy, and maintain legal safeguards. Another factor is ongoing legal considerations. Some documents may be sealed because they relate to matters that are still under review, part of separate proceedings, or connected to investigations that have not been concluded. Releasing such information could interfere with those processes. There is also the issue of confidential sources and methods. Investigations sometimes rely on information that cannot be publicly disclosed without compromising how it was obtained. In these cases, records may remain sealed to preserve the integrity of investigative practices. This creates a layer of restricted knowledge. Certain details may exist within official records but are not available for use in open court or public discussion. As a result, they do not become part of the visible trial narrative. Confidentiality agreements can also play a role. In some situations, individuals involved in a case may be bound by legal agreements that limit what they can disclose. These agreements can restrict testimony or prevent certain information from being introduced in court. Another important point is selective unsealing. Courts may choose to release portions of previously sealed material at a later time. However, this process is controlled and does not necessarily result in full disclosure. This means that even after a trial concludes, some information may remain partially or fully restricted. The impact on trials is significant. If evidence is sealed or subject to confidentiality rules, it may not be presented to the jury, even if it exists within the broader record. This further defines what is, and is not, brought to trial. It also shapes public understanding. Observers may be aware that additional material exists, but without access to it, they can only rely on what has been officially presented and released. This reinforces a key idea. A trial is based on accessible and admissible evidence, not necessarily the entirety of available information. Sealed records and confidentiality restrictions ensure that certain material remains outside that scope. Understanding this helps explain why some aspects of a case remain unseen and unexamined in open court, even when they are part of the official record. When a case concludes, the legal outcome is clear, but public understanding is often shaped by more than just what was presented in court. This creates a gap between the official record and the broader perception of the case. At the center of this gap is a simple reality. A trial represents only a portion of the available information. As explored in earlier sections, many factors determine what is included: evidence rules, time limits, jurisdiction, strategy, and confidentiality. Everything outside those boundaries remains unexamined in court, even if it exists in investigative or public records. This can influence how the case is interpreted. Some observers focus strictly on what was proven, relying on the legal findings as the most reliable source of truth. Others may consider additional material, reports, documents, or discussions that extend beyond the trial. Both approaches draw from different layers of information. This creates multiple perspectives. One perspective is grounded in verified, legally tested evidence. Another includes broader contextual material, which may not have been subject to the same level of scrutiny. Understanding the difference between these perspectives is essential. Without that distinction, it becomes easy to blur the line between confirmed facts and untested information. Media coverage plays a major role in this process. Journalists and analysts interpret court proceedings, summarize key findings, and sometimes highlight information that was not part of the trial itself. This can expand the narrative, but it can also introduce varying levels of certainty. Another factor is information availability. Some documents are public, while others remain sealed or partially released. This uneven access means that different audiences may have different levels of insight, depending on what material they can review. As a result, public understanding is often layered and evolving. New information may emerge over time, previously sealed records may be released, and ongoing analysis may revisit earlier conclusions. However, these developments do not change the original legal outcome. They add context around it. This distinction is critical. The trial defines what has been legally established. Public discussion explores what may exist beyond that boundary. Recognizing this helps maintain clarity. It allows the legal record to be understood on its own terms, while also acknowledging that it is part of a larger and more complex picture. In cases involving extensive investigations, this gap is not unusual. It reflects the limits of what a courtroom can address compared to the broader scope of available information. After examining evidence selection, admissibility rules, time limits, jurisdiction, investigative leads, legal strategy, and confidentiality, a clear conclusion emerges. A trial is not a complete account of an investigation. It is a structured legal process with defined limits. What is brought to trial represents a carefully selected set of charges and evidence, material that meets strict legal standards and can be effectively presented within a courtroom setting. Everything outside that structure, even if documented or discussed, remains beyond the scope of the case. This creates two parallel realities. The first is the legal record. This includes charges that were filed, evidence that was admitted, arguments that were tested, and conclusions that were reached. It is the most authoritative account, because it is based on material that has been examined under formal legal standards. The second is the broader investigative context. This includes leads, documents, associations, and information that may exist outside the courtroom. Some of this material may be incomplete, restricted, or not suitable for legal presentation. While it contributes to overall understanding, it does not carry the same status as evidence tested in court. The distinction between these two is essential. A trial answers specific legal questions. What can be proven? What meets the burden of proof? What falls within the defined charges? It does not attempt to answer every possible question related to a case. This is why certain elements are never brought to trial. Some are excluded due to rules of admissibility. Others fall outside legal timeframes or jurisdiction. Some remain unverified or incomplete, and others are limited by strategy, confidentiality, or procedural constraints. Each of these factors contributes to a process of selection. The result is not a full narrative, but a focused and testable framework designed to reach a legal conclusion. Understanding this framework helps clarify an important point. The absence of information in a trial does not necessarily mean that it does not exist. It means that it was not included within the legal structure of that case. This is a function of the system, not an exception. Courts are designed to evaluate specific, provable claims, not to explore every aspect of a broader situation. This ensures that outcomes are based on reliable and admissible evidence, even if it means leaving some areas unaddressed. In complex cases, this limitation becomes more visible. Large volumes of information, multiple jurisdictions, and extended timelines create a wide field of material, only part of which can be translated into a courtroom proceeding. The result is a defined outcome with clear boundaries. What is proven becomes part of the legal record. What is not included remains outside that record. In conclusion, understanding what was never brought to trial is not about identifying omissions. It is about recognizing the structure and limits of the legal process itself. It reveals how investigations are transformed into cases, how evidence is filtered into arguments, and how courts ultimately define what can be established as fact under the law. The documents exist. The questions remain. This channel will continue examining what is public, and what is still hidden. If you value documented analysis over speculation, consider subscribing. More files coming.